Is that a little better? Thank you. All right, as promised, we are going to begin promptly 7 minutes late. So if you will please bring the chambers to order. Good evening. Shh. Shh. There we go. A good evening to you all, and a thank you all for being here. For those of you that I've not met before, I'm County Supervisor Joe Simitian. It is my privilege and pleasure to represent the 5th Supervisorial District here in Santa Clara County, which includes all or part of 8 incorporated communities, including all of Palo Alto, Mountain View, Los Altos Hills, Cupertino, Saratoga, half of Sunnyvale, a small portion of San Jose, and for purposes of tonight's meeting, probably important to say, all of the unincorporated lands at Stanford University that are within Santa Clara County. And again, I want to welcome you all. I want to thank you for being here. This is an opportunity for members of the public to both ask questions about the pending application of Stanford University for roughly, well, not roughly, 2,275,000 square feet, am I remembering correctly, and 3,150 beds or units of housing. Depends a little bit on the conversation. And that's the sort of the bare bones basics. There are a number of documents at the back, and I just want to make sure people saw that we have an agenda. We have a comment form for EIR comments. That's the draft environmental impact report. And we also have a notice of availability document with some helpful maps that is in the back as well. I believe the university has placed somewhere in the back a couple of documents that they have prepared. These are their communications about the application. You may find those helpful as well. Then we've got some folks who are here from the university, so at various points, if you would like to talk to them about the application after the meeting breaks, I'm sure they would be welcome to hear from you, hear your comments or questions directly. Why don't I ask them to raise their hands so that you can spot them? Okay, they're, a little higher than that, please. There we go. And thank you. And we thank them for being here as well. I should mention for the record that this meeting is being taped and will be part of the public record in terms of the formal process. And we also have a court reporter on hand to take down both comments and questions to make sure that between the taping and the court reporter, we get it all right. Meanwhile, we are being streamed live, and our folks from cable TV will have a permanent record of the meeting and its comments and questions as well. Why don't I turn it over to Kirk Gerard for a moment, who is the county's Director of Planning and Development, to give us what I'd call a relatively high-level overview and explain the public process in a little more detail. Kirk and his team are the responsible staff at the county for processing the university's application. I'll let him introduce the folks who have been part of the team thus far, and after he's had a chance to lay it out, I'll offer a few more comments of my own. And again, there are very different roles here. This is the professional staff, this is the elected official. We have different roles and responsibilities, and so I want first to ask the professional staff to lay out the application, working with the team that he has assembled. So, Mr. Gerard, go to it.
Thank you very much, Supervisor Simitian. I'm Kirk Gerard, I'm the Director of Planning and Development, and I have overall responsibility for the processing of this application, but we also have staff that are part of our team. Kavitha Kumar, who is the project planner, is here. And I hate to say this, I thought David Rader was going to be here, but he is not. and that's probably my misconception. But we do have the experts that are behind the draft environmental impact report that was prepared. We have Greg Leishman with AECOM. They are our sub-consultant traffic expert that reviewed all the work associated with the traffic. We have our prime contractor for the draft EIR preparation from ESA. We've got Brian Boxer and Paul Mitchell. And if we have any technical questions tonight, we will either try to answer them here tonight or record and answer them later. So what my objective is to first welcome everybody here and say that the purpose of these meetings, thank you for letting me know I should speak louder. I'll swallow the mic here. So the purpose of the meetings is to try to educate you so that you can comment constructively on the EIR. We are going to go over the project at a very high level. Supervisor Simitian said I'm going to describe the draft EIR at another high level, but with a focus on the areas we're particularly interested in receiving input from the public and jurisdictions in the area of Stanford, and then finally describe the review of the draft EIR and the review of the permit at large, so you understand how the process is going to work from here going forward. Those are the objectives of the meeting. And with this, it was supposed to advance the slide. So am I too far away from a source with this? It did.
Patience is a virtue.
Okay, it advanced. All right. So we have an application from Stanford for the next increment of development at the university. As Supervisor Simitian said, this development would happen within the academic growth boundary, which is in the lands governed by the county, and that's the area in green. The application is being submitted as part of the county's land use regulatory framework for Stanford, and that includes the community plan that was adopted in 2000, which is a specific plan for the campus, part of the county's general plan, and provides all the broad policies that apply on the campus property.
Can you put the map up in bigger so that people know the boundaries?
I certainly will. This might help even better because the next slide is going to have a more detailed map. But if you want, I can see this. Yeah.
This shows all road boundaries.
Yeah, this is really intended to just show all the campus lands in relation to those that are in the unincorporated area.
And Kirk, let me interrupt and just ask Christina Loquist to bring a copy of the hard copy paper document that has the map. Hand it to Ms. Kaufman in the front row. That ought to solve that one immediate problem. Otherwise, we're going to just be limited to the technology that the council chambers have. Alice, if you'll just raise your hand. Right there. Thank you.
Okay. Once the community plan was adopted in 2000, Stanford at the same time applied for a general use permit, the first increment of development that was applied for under the 2000 community plan. And we are at the final allotment of development is a part of that 2000 general use permit, which prompted the application for the 2018 general use permit. There is a final EIR that was written and is available for both the community plan and that 2000 general use permit. And that's also important because the combination of the 2000 general use permit and the 2000 environmental impact report are what set the conditions and environmental mitigations for the development that's currently occurring at the university. Midstream, during the execution or the development of the 2000 general use permit, Stanford prepared a sustainability study. The sustainability study was intended to look beyond the time frame of the general use permit and evaluate what the build-out of the campus was and whether or not the anticipated growth of the campus could be accommodated within the academic growth boundary. And that document is also available. This is what Stanford is applying for as a part of the 2018 general use permit, and this is not a good detailed roadmap, but it does show the various districts of the campus and what is proposed in each district. It's a very distant PowerPoint, and I apologize for that, but the summary here is that Stanford is asking for 2.275 million square feet of academic and academic support space, 3,150 new on-campus housing units. A portion of the housing would be earmarked for faculty and staff. The other portion would be student housing beds. 40,000 net new square feet of child care centers and facilities, and some smaller requests associated with parking and some changes that are mostly boundary corrections to the general plan and zoning maps on the campus. The time frame for this request is over a 17-year period, and the development has been allocated by district. And if you can see this, the number of beds and the development capacity proposed for each district are laid out in these maps. There is no development proposed for the Foothill and San Juan districts. We are, by the way, going to post this so that you'll be able to see any detail that you can't see tonight. It'll be on our website. To put this request in perspective, these are two bar graphs. The top bar graph shows the amount of academic and academic support construction at the campus in square feet. The red is that existed prior to the 2000 general use permit application. The orangish color was the amount that was requested and granted as a part of the 2000 general use permit. And the yellow is what's being proposed as a part of the 2018 general use permit. The bar chart below is the number of housing units and/or beds, depending upon if you're talking about faculty staff housing or student beds. It's effectively about an 11% ask on top of the development that's been permitted at the campus. Now, as I mentioned, this application is in the context of the regulatory framework of the county. And there are policies that govern individual use permit applications that are found in the community plan. Some key policies here that relate to this application is the academic growth boundary. That's the area on the campus that is designed to support relatively high density academic support and housing development. And this general use permit proposes no change in the academic growth boundary. None of the development entitlements requested would be asked for outside of the academic growth boundary. Another major policy area is to prefer reduction of traffic from the university instead of the university expanding the capacity of streets around the university to accommodate increases in traffic. This is referred to as the no new net trip goal, and the specific standard is based on a cordon that registers traffic in and out of the university academic growth area, a 2001 baseline, and then every year thereafter, the traffic that goes across that cordon 2 times a year is measured in the morning and evening peak hours and compared to the 2001 baseline. The goal is that that number never increases. And during the development of the 2000 general use permit allocation, they were able to accomplish that goal through traffic demand management. And the intention of this use permit is to maintain that goal, i.e. not have any traffic go beyond the cordon above that was recorded in the 2001 baseline study. 2 other major policy issues is the ratio of housing provided to the academic square footage requested. And the proposal is to maintain the ratio that was approved by the county in the 2000 general use permit. It requires that Stanford build 605 units per 500,000 square footage of development. And that there are checkpoints at each 500,000, and Stanford can't ask or be granted the another 500,000 until they've fully satisfied the housing requirements of the previous 500,000. And then finally, there is a contribution to a low-income housing fund that Stanford established in the 2000 general use permit, and they're proposing to maintain that contribution, but at a rate of $20 a square foot adjusted for inflation over time. That money is collected by the county, and under the 2000 general use permit had to be invested in low-income housing projects within a 6-mile radius of the university. Stanford is proposing that that 6-mile radius be not the governing factor, that instead the money could be spent within an area that's defined as a transit hub that would serve as the university. That's their proposal, and so that is a change in what is currently in the general use permit, the 2000 general use permit. So that concludes my overview of the application. Now I'm going to just give you another very high-level overview of the draft environmental impact report. So the environmental impact report, just to provide a setting here, is really to look at the effect of the project on the environment and ways that the project could be operated or designed to minimize those effects, and an evaluation of alternatives besides the proposed project that might also minimize environmental impacts. That's it in a nutshell. This draft EIR is organized along these lines. There's 2 volumes and appendices, and it's largely because it's a very weighty document. We're doing as many meetings as we can to introduce people to this document because it requires extensive reading to fully understand the analysis and the conclusions in the draft EIR. So these are the environmental topics covered in the draft EIR. And the basic framework for analysis is to analyze the setting and the baseline. What are the conditions now under all these environmental parameters? What effect would the proposed project have on those conditions? How might it affect that particular baseline for that particular environmental parameter? And then compare that effect to what are considered significance criteria. And those are, for a particular parameter, what have the communities, the local agencies, sometimes the state, sometimes authorities in that particular environmental arena have determined to be significant under CEQA, so that if your increment of impact is above a certain level, then it would be considered a significant effect under CEQA. And then finally, for that parameter, the increase in the baseline, where it stands in the significance criteria, how could you make changes to what is proposed in the name of mitigations to reduce that environmental effect? That's the basic framework, and I go through that to say it's that analysis and the information that's in the draft EIR that we need help on, because often local communities or jurisdictions have a very clear understanding of what are existing conditions, what might this project do to the existing conditions, what in their estimation would be significant, and then finally, are there other things that can be done to manage this project so that we're reducing those effects on the community and the environment. Now, I wanted to quickly go over what are issues of concern that were expressed by the community at the time we issued what's called the Notice of Preparation, which is to say that we're about ready to begin an EIR process, and we want to hear from the communities what they think are the important aspects that need to be evaluated given the community in this particular project. And I'm going over these, one, because I know some of these concerns are on your mind, but two, to prompt you in what some of your neighbors and jurisdictions and agencies have considered to be important issues associated with this project. So I'll say two that are leading contenders for the most significant issues are housing and transportation.
And again, Kirk, just a little bit louder if you could, please. I know
Okay.
that if you can
So
pull that
people
microphone a
straining?
little closer
Yeah,
to you.
I think I've run out of cord.
The challenge, everybody, is that the microphones don't come this far back, so that means we have to lean in.
Which is
and then-
unnatural.
And then speak loudly.
Okay, thank you. So under housing, many of the issues expressed are associated with the jobs housing balance. If this project is going to increase the population of the university and those people demanding housing, it could exacerbate the jobs housing balance on the peninsula, and how is that going to be contended with? And I'll use housing as an example of sometimes the environmental analysis under CEQA doesn't cover the entirety of the issue, in that there are prescribed ways that individual parameters are evaluated, prescribed significance criteria, and that sometimes an issue will have environmental ramifications, but also significant policy ramifications. They're both covered as a part of the permit process. Our decision makers, before they would accept the proposal, would have to determine that the project meets the requirements of our general plan and our ordinances, and that the environmental document that's prepared and the mitigations that are identified meet the requirements of CEQA and the standards of environmental review. So housing is one of those issues that have both environmental components and policy components, and many of the concerns for housing are really in the policy realm. Transportation impacts. The environmental impact report analyzes the project in two ways. One way is, what if the traffic demand management measures don't work and traffic increases as a result of the project beyond Stanford? What effect would be on intersections and road segments and freeways in the vicinity? So the assumption is there are no traffic demand management programs. What are the impacts on the roadways? Another analysis is the vehicle miles traveled, and that is, given the population changes that are driven by the project in terms of the students and the faculties, growth in the area, how many miles will they likely be traveling as a part of their interaction with this project? And that's vehicle miles traveled. The state under CEQA right now is switching from a framework where you're evaluating the project for its effect on congestion in the community to an evaluation of the project in relation to how many vehicle miles are going to be traveled, which relates to greenhouse gas emissions and a host of environmental effects. To cover both bases, this draft EIR covers both analyses. And the final scenario is that the traffic demand management programs will work. The project will attain the no net new trip framework. And what are the programs that would have to be implemented to do that? How would that be measured? And what would happen if there were increases associated with the project, but slight increases? The traffic demand management, I'll explain this now, is going to be handled at 3 different levels.
I think I need to ask you to accelerate a little so that we get to the comments and questions from the members of the public. All right, thank you.
I tend to get a little too detailed, but if you have questions about how the traffic demand management mitigation program would work, I'd be happy to answer them. So then we'll go to other issues, and I have quite a host of them here. I don't want to go into all of them, but population and housing on and off the campus. As I mentioned, the flexibility, or the feasibility and methodology of the No New Net Trip program, and et cetera. You'll recognize many of these as your concerns or your neighbors' concerns. Now, I want to show the approach that is used in the EIR for drawing conclusions on the effects of the project on various parameters. And this is for transportation. The first analysis that's in the document is of these potential impacts associated with transportation, which impacts are less than significant given the project. which impacts are significant, what mitigation might be applied, and then finally, after you apply the mitigation, does that impact rise to levels of significance? Now, I put transportation in the PowerPoint, but you'll see this analysis for all the parameters in the document. This final table summarizes the results of those conclusions. This is the list of those impacts that are determined right now in the draft EIR to be less than significant with mitigation, and then significant and unavoidable. And that means that even after mitigations are applied, the impact is above the significance criteria established for those parameters. And we have significance for construction noise, transportation and traffic, assuming the traffic demand management program is not implemented, and then finally, the potential destruction of an historic resource on the campus. Another section of the draft EIR is the alternatives, and 3 major alternatives are evaluated. The no project alternative, which means Stanford stops growing. The no project alternative meaning that instead of doing a programmatic general use permit that allocates a large development allotment that can be drawn upon with incremental building permits, Stanford would instead have to apply for use permits for every development that occurs on the campus and do an individual environmental review. There's a reduced project alternative, which is a reduction in what is proposed by a little more than half. And then finally, a historic preservation alternative, where under no circumstances would a historic resource deemed significant be modified or demolished. And under the comparison of alternatives, the no project alternative is the most environmentally desirable, followed by the reduced project alternative. So as I mentioned, the environmental impact report is long, but there are other documents that would help a reader fully understand it. One, the parent community plan and the 2000 general use permit, the 2000 environmental impact report that was prepared, the 2008 sustainability study, and something that is of particular interest is every year since the 2000 general use permit was approved, an annual report card in evaluating how the development complied or not with the general use permit and the community plan was prepared and presented to the Planning Commission, and those are all on our website. And then finally, the traffic analysis of the traffic demand management program and the coordinate counts to demonstrate that compliance or non-compliance with the no new net trips goal. And then there's the application itself that Stanford applied. This is a quick overview of the process. We have a 60-day review we're in the middle of right now. After we receive all the comments, those comments will be responded to, and the response to comments in the draft EIR will be published as a final EIR. We anticipate that in early spring to 2018. That document, plus the analysis of the project's consistency with our general plan and zoning, will be prepared and then followed by hearings with first the Planning Commission and then the Board of Supervisors for a final decision. We have this public input meeting, another one scheduled on November 30th, and then one that we don't have the location and time for in the city of Meadow Park that we'll fix within the next week or so. And at these hearings, we are welcoming people to provide verbal comment and submit any written comments they might have. This is where you can get the document. We're planning on spreading around, but we have a couple libraries. Ideally, you'd be able to review it electronically and download it from our website. We have a counter copy at the City of Palo Alto, and we're going to provide 2 copies to the libraries in Menlo Park. You can send written comments to David Rader at his email address or to us at our mailing address. And like I said, at these hearings, we're also recording the comments and they will be formally responded to. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to walk through again how we're going to proceed at this point, I want to begin again by thanking all of you who turned out. We need your participation in order to get the best possible result, so I want to thank every one of you for being here. I want to call out, to the extent that I can find them, some of our elected officials. I know I saw Councilmember Lydia Koo, if you would raise your hand so your constituents can see you, and Councilmember Eric Filseth, who is in the back. And I thought I saw Councilmember Karen Holman walk in as well. I did. Thank you, Councilmember, for joining us. And an appointed official of some relevance in this case is our Planning Commission member, Kathy Schmidt, who is here. Would you raise your hand? Oh, a little higher, Kathy. Don't be shy. Thank you. Who is one of our 7 appointed planning commissioners. And I'm pretty sure I saw Melissa Baton-Caswell. I did, from the Palo Alto School Board here as well. And I see staff is here from Assemblymember Mark Berman's office, and we want to thank them for joining us as well, and thank the Assemblymember for sending them to take the pulse of the community tonight. So thank you all for being here. What I'm going to do now is share a brief take from the elected official's perspective, and also someone who has some personal history with this story. Apparently some of you do as well. And then talk a little bit about process, but I want to get quickly to your comments and questions. Some of you will know that just by chance, from the years 1997 to 2000, I was serving on the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors at the time, and that was the last time we had the opportunity to go through this exercise. So we have been down this path before at the county, and this community has been down the path before. As you heard, the GUP, the general use permit, was approved back in the year 2000. Stanford had asked for 2 million square feet and change of facilities at the time, 3,000 housing units. Ultimately, pretty much all of that was approved. One of the significant developments in that exercise was that the housing was not only approved, but required, as you heard from our county staff. I think you all can be the judge of how well that process has or has not worked in the intervening 17 years, but I think we are well served, frankly, by the fact that this is not our first time through this exercise. We have done it before, and by coincidence, I just happen to have the good fortune to be back on the Board of Supervisors to do it a second time with you all. So thank you again for helping us get to a good result. I want to underscore something that was referenced earlier, but that I think is tremendously important. We have an application from the applicant, Stanford University. We are now in the process of evaluating what the impacts of the proposed project are. This is the time, let me say that again, this is the time for people who have opinions about what is or isn't in the draft environmental impact report to speak up. The closing date for comments is December the 4th. So between now and that time, I want to urge every one of you to take the time, and I know it's a challenge as a member of the community, but take the time to review the environmental impact report and to make your comments either tonight or in writing. If you make them tonight, they will be captured, they will be considered formal comments for purposes of the EIR, and they will be responded to in the EIR process. If you make them in writing, that's always ideal because there's usually a little more precision in the written documents than there is in the off the cuff at the moment. But again, you know, if you're thinking maybe you have the best of intentions but might not ever get around to putting it in writing, please do take advantage of the opportunity tonight. If you think there is something missing from the EIR, now is the time to tell us. If you think there is something that the EIR doesn't consider fully or accurately, now is the time to tell us. If you think the EIR got it spot on and want to say so, now is the time to tell us. And as I said in the letter I sent out to the elected officials, we can't consider your comments if you don't make them. So now is the time, and I do hope you will make them. Ultimately, after that December 4th date comes, it will be the responsibility of the county to produce a final environmental impact report. And as you heard, the process, to grossly oversimplify, is we have a 7-member planning commission, one of whom is here tonight. The application will be heard by that planning commission. It will ultimately come to the 5-member board of supervisors on which I sit, and there will be a vote by the board of supervisors considering the application. It is at that time that the various mitigations that have been identified, proposed, suggested, resisted, whatever, will be under consideration, and final action comes when at least 3 members of the board cast a vote one way or the other. I underscored this, I think, at Palo Alto City Council meeting and Menlo Park recently, but I wanted to underscore it for all of you who are here tonight. unlike your city council here in Palo Alto or in Menlo Park or in most of our other neighboring communities, we have district elections for our county board of supervisors. I represent 400,000 folks in the area that I described earlier. That means that, for better or worse, I'm the only county supervisor you've got if you live in the affected jurisdiction. It also means that there are 4 other county supervisors, a majority of the 5-member board, who will be voting to approve or deny, and on various mitigations that are proposed, who do not represent the community in which the land use application exists. So just please be mindful of that as we go through the process. I just want to sort of underscore a couple of things. It has been my experience in land use matters, having served, as some of you know, here previously and on the Board of Supervisors, that some folks view every application as an opportunity to say, we want this, 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 and this. And it doesn't work that way. We have an application. The applicant has certain rights and responsibilities as an applicant. One of the responsibilities is to fully mitigate any of the adverse impacts that are identified during the EIR process. But the applicant also has certain rights, and one of the rights is not to be asked to pony up, for lack of a better phrase, for things that are not related to the project. So we end up having what we call a quasi-judicial process, which means we are trying to weigh the facts. What is the nature of the application? What are the impacts that have been identified? What can be done to mitigate those impacts? And then exercise judgment in as close to an objective and impartial world as we can possibly create. So I want to underscore that process. It is different than a legislative process where your city council or your board of supervisors says, I like it, I'm for it, I don't like it, I'm against it. We have, as I say, a different process here. I'm going to stop right there and ask again, Christina Loquist is going to bring cards up to me if you have already filled them out. I'm going to call you up and ask you to come to the microphone just like it was a Palo Alto City Council meeting. We're going to ask you to limit your questions or comments to 3 minutes, please. I have deliberately unplugged the annoying buzzer noise so that all it will do is flash at you, but I ask you to respect the flashing light. And when you ask a question, it may be appropriate for staff or the consulting team. It may be appropriate for me as the elected official. It may be that nobody wants to answer your question because they don't have the information or because it would be inappropriate in this particular context. So we'll sort of play that from card to card. I have all of the cards in my hand so far. If at some point you would like to turn in a card and haven't done so, just raise your hand and my capable staff will find you. There you go. See how easy that was? And then meanwhile, I am shuffling the cards and I'm going to draw them at random. And we're going to ask 3 or 4 of you to come on up, starting with Alice Smith. And then, is it Neva Yarkin? And Forrest Peterson? And Ms. Peak, I think. Come on up.
Thank you. I'm Alice Smith. I live at 850 Webster Street, Palo Alto. I'm a long-term resident. Since it took an hour to go down University Avenue the other day just to get out of the town, it seems to me that transportation is not being addressed by your adequately in this plan. I would like the following. I would like you to have dedicated land for a school at Stanford, which will mitigate on transportation alone, a dedicated daycare center for children who would be additional to this if this went through. I don't think it should go through. Not as, that you look at the runoff from the macadamization of the lands, because this is actually a very intense area for tropical rains, and right now the land would become more and more cemented, and as a result you'll have tremendous runoff, and we already have a problem at San Francisco Creek. I want you to look at not allowing any student at Stanford to be able to drive a car. That if you really want to have transportation control, you have to stop the cars at Stanford. In addition, this is just for this university. It has nothing to do with the, I believe it's $2 million additional development at Stanford Industrial Park. These are going on at the same time. So therefore, I think you need to, and the hospital hasn't even opened yet. And when the hospital opens, we don't even know what the impact will be. So what you're doing is you're saying, give us tonight to 2035 at a time when the entire area has ground to a halt, where the quality of life in the Palo Alto Mid-Peninsula area is becoming extremist from both a transportation and a housing. You offer no housing, you put 20% of something or other into low-income housing. Well, you must build housing. You cannot just say, okay, we'll give somebody else the problem. I see the light going on.
You have a minute left.
But in fact, this is just, what can I do for Stanford University? It has nothing to do with the quality of life in Santa Clara County or San Mateo County, which is also impacted. I think Stanford has a duty of care, and they're not exercising it. When they did a trade-off with 3 sports parks, that was for 50 years. I don't want to see these deals that say, well, we can do it to a certain time, and then after that, we don't have any obligation. Stanford has a very high duty of care, and frankly, I don't think this makes it. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And by the way, Ms. Smith, I know you've reached out to me in my office on another matter. I have not forgotten. We just want to let you know. Is it Neva Yarkin?
Neva Yarkin.
Neva, excuse me.
I live at 133 Churchill Avenue. I have 2 questions. What about the infrastructure? New roads, which I think you'll need, elementary schools, supermarkets, gas stations, shopping malls, and medical clinics. Where will the land be for all this? What about emergency services, police and firefighters? Where will the money come for this? Thank you.
Thank you. And let me just ask county staff to briefly mention the extent and nature of to which the process addresses infrastructure needs briefly.
There are analysis of the population increases from the project and what services they would require, and the suitability of those services in the area. So those are all available in the draft EIR, that analysis.
And do I remember correctly that the population increase is a little bit greater than 9,600?
That's correct, and that's a combination of students and faculty and staff.
Thank you, just so folks know what we're talking about. Forrest Peterson, to be followed by Ms. Peak, I believe.
My name is Forrest Peterson. I'm a graduate student at Stanford in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and I'm also a resident in Palo Alto on Grant Avenue. So I'd like to speak about the low-income employees at Stanford. I think that includes right now graduate students, postdocs, and then the the maintenance staff and things like that. So as the lower salaried or hourly employees, we are dependent on the housing in the community. And so as part of the proposed mitigation, Stanford's talked about contributing to the low-income housing stock. So when I looked at the general use, the permit application summary, on page 17, it proposes 1,600 net new beds in EV. But then over on, and this is in addition.
Why don't you tell everybody what EV stands for?
Oh, I'm
You and
sorry.
I know, but.
Escondido Village.
Thanks.
It's the graduate housing for the students with dependents. These are everything from single parents to full family units live there. So this 1,600 is in addition to the 1,400 units that were recently approved. So it actually comes out closer to about 3,000. So then on page 21 to 23, it goes into the affordable housing contribution. And this is where I am generally a little bit confused on exactly what it means, and that's why this is a question I have to ask. Specifically how is Stanford contributing to that affordable housing contribution? Because it says here that Stanford contributed 800 units under the 2000 GUP, and then they're going to contribute 450 units under the 2018 GUP. And it says that the value of the affordable housing that they're contributing is $100 million, which is $45 per square foot, and that's contributed completely through student housing for graduate students and students like myself. But they're proposing under the GUP to contribute $50 million to the community housing low-income fund. So it sounds like the entire amount by far that's being contributed to the Affordable Housing Fund will be satisfied simply through graduate student housing. So I just want to see if I'm understanding this correctly.
Let me ask staff to lean in, and then I may have a comment of my own.
So I'm not surprised that that's confusing, because there are really two ways to look at the project. One is, of the housing that Stanford is proposing on the campus, how much of that housing would be considered affordable using the standards that apply to affordability in the area? And the number you mentioned about the graduate student housing satisfying this number of affordable units, that's true, but that's apart from the contribution that Stanford would make to low-income housing projects off the campus. So, and there's no proposal for a trade-off between the two. In other words, if they provide more affordable housing on campus, then they would pay less in the off-site impact fee. The proposal is $20 per square foot of academic space that would go for the off-site campus. And then what they're saying is that if they build the academic or the graduate student housing that they're planning to build, a certain number of them will meet the affordability criteria that are established in our housing element. So they cover both bases. I'll give you an analogy. A developer will build some affordable units in their development, but they will also pay for off-site housing impact fees, and Stanford is proposing to do both.
And let me just say, from the standpoint of one of the 5 elected officials who has to consider these factors, again, I'm going to try and simplify a little bit and leave out some of the details. There are 9,600 more folks who are going to be on campus. That's going to create some housing demand. The question is how much? And the question is how much for what range of folks at various income levels? So we've got, to grossly oversimplify, faculty, staff, students, and then other workers. And different folks have different levels of income and will be able or unable to access housing to greater and lesser degrees depending on their income. So the first question we're going to ask is, if we've got 9,600 new folks, what level of demand does that create for housing? Then we'll look at what the university is proposing to provide in the way of housing and ask ourselves, does the level of demand match up with the level of housing provided, including the various income levels or levels of affordability? Then, as our staff has indicated, in addition, there is a development fee, just as the city charges a developer fee. There's a developer fee built into the process at present, and there would be, consistent with the proposal from Stanford, going forward. But it's on us as decision makers to ask ourselves, what kind of demand would be generated, and are the proposed mitigations adequate to meet that demand? And if not, what are we going to do about it? Let me just turn to the planning staff and say, understanding you're apolitical in this process, have I said anything that's factually inaccurate about the process? Permission to speak freely in front of 125 of my closest friends here. So,
I'll say that is absolute fair analysis. The amount at which a particular applicant has to provide housing for their development is a policy decision.
all right. Ms. Peak, and then we're going to go to a new group of speakers. Isaac, is it Ashler? James Cornett, David Milsom, and Donald Barr. Ms. Peak, are you still with us? You are. Thank you. No worries. Welcome.
Hi. So I just have a few comments. I think it's important to remember that Stanford always pretends that they're just this little university, but I think of them as this massive research and development conglomerate, a real estate investment and management corporation, an enormously oversized hospital complex, and lastly, a sort of mid-sized university that apparently has so much endowment money that they just can't spend it fast enough trying to overdevelop the area all around their campus. So I feel like they just came off of many millions of square feet that they've added from the 2000 GUP. They're not even finished building all the housing they said they were going to build. We've had, if you look at the campus, it used to be open, green. I mean, I went there 30 years ago, but, now it's just building after building. It's all filled in. It's obviously changed quite a bit. They're one of the largest employers in the area. I feel that their growth has been really irresponsible in degrading the surrounding community and our quality of life. And I feel that, they've had all this other development. They've got the hospital that hasn't even opened. They're just building like crazy. And we don't even know what's going to happen. And yet here they are back again asking for millions of more square feet, when we don't even see what's happened with the last millions that they built. I think it's time to wait a while and see what's going to happen. They claim they don't add to the traffic, but if you look closely at all the exemptions to their traffic plans, they do. If you live on campus, you can have a car. There's parking. If they're not adding any traffic, where are all the new parking garages going up everywhere? I mean, obviously they're adding traffic. Traffic not just from them, but everywhere is getting worse, but they're a big part of it. My big question is, does anybody ever say, what's the max? How big can they get? I'd really like to know a number that at some point I can say, they will stop one day and we can start to deal with this all. I mean, it seems like everything here, it's just more and more and more. How can we cram more in? Can we have a number for what their maximum size and their maximum population will be? It'd be nice if it was not just Stanford, but Palo Alto, every other city around here. It'd be really nice. I think personally that this area has already surpassed a reasonable population. Ecologically, California is in bad trouble, but quality of life here, transportation, getting around in your car, infrastructure, community services, all these things are impacted by too many people. So I would just like to know, how big do they get? Or do they just come back every 15 years and ask for another 3, 4, 5 million square feet? Sometimes it seems like Stanford thinks that they are housed in this large metropolitan area. They have this hospital that was approved by the Palo Alto City Council that's bigger than the hospital at UCLA, which is in Los Angeles, which has 4 million people. How much stuff do they need? Okay, so finally, what I'd like the Board of Supervisors to say is like a one-word response to their application, which is no.
Thank you. Folks, let me a couple things. First, thank you for your comments. Second, I'm going to ask folks not to applaud, boo, hiss, and the reason for that is that it's not easy for everybody to come up to the microphone, particularly if they feel like the point of view they share may not be the majority point of view. So if we can just ask you to nod and smile or shake your heads in concern, but I want to just try and keep a safe space for everybody, no matter what their point of view is, at the microphone. Second thing is I do want to respond to the question that was asked about maximum build-out. And let me just say, this is one of the issues that I certainly had hoped would be addressed by the 2000 GUP, and that still remains open. And that's the matter of understanding what I call the ultimate carrying capacity for the site. Or, in other words, what is full build-out, the maximum amount of development that can be accommodated on the site. When we did the 2000 GUP, 17 years ago now, and the community plan, we required the university to submit something called a sustainable development study that, and I'm going to quote directly from it because this issue's been coming up. As part of the GUP and community plan, Stanford was required to submit a sustainable development study that, quote, shall identify the maximum planned build-out potential for all of Stanford's unincorporated Santa Clara County land, end quote. Now, that study was to have been submitted and approved by the Board of Supervisors prior to acceptance of applications for the second half of the academic development allowed by the old 2000 GUP. And in 2009, when the university submitted a sustainable development study to the Board of Supervisors, there was not a maximum plan build-out potential for all of Stanford's unincorporated Santa Clara County land identified at that time. Instead, the study that was submitted looked at the ability of the campus to absorb different amounts of development over a 25-year time horizon. And while the study did provide important information about how much development could be accommodated on the campus, which is a question that you've raised, it didn't get to the actual requirement in the 2000 GUP and community plan of identifying build-out potential. That's information that I think would be helpful to have, and on a track separate and apart from the draft environmental impact report, we're certainly looking at options for understanding that important piece of the picture, which in my view remains incomplete. Okay, hope that is responsive to the question, and the story goes on. All right, I think that takes us to Isaac Ashler, James Cornett, David Milsom, and Donald Barr. Could we ask you to step up, please? And folks, if you can come up a little more quickly, that means we can move along a little more quickly. I'm sorry, I may have taken you off track. Step right up. Mr. Ashler?
No. Do you want to do this in order, Mr. Ashler?
I want the first person near the microphone to grab it and tell us what they think.
I summarize quickly. I didn't have a chance to think about it. But I want to, first of all, to change the nomenclature of development to destroyment. It's basically a destruction of the environment. We do not develop the environment. This is first. Now, another thing, I heard that 10,000 people are going to be added through this project to Palo Alto. This is about 20% increase in the population, more or less, of Palo Alto. And one other thing that I found is the traffic in Palo Alto and in the Bay Area is already choked. Now, and also the pollution that the traffic brings into the Bay Area. I think until there is a plan for public transportation in the whole Bay Area, we should not at all think about this project development. And that's what I want to summarize.
Thank you. And could you share your name with me again, just so I know who's spoken and who hasn't?
Isaac Achler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Achler, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name earlier. Is James Cornett close?
Close. Very
Close.
Yes. Hi. James Cornett, a resident of Palo Alto, 420 Sequoia Avenue. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. One question and then one comment. The question is, I noticed with the additional number of living units on the campus, I looked for something that might talk about where those residents might park their cars. I didn't see it in the draft EIR thus far. It may be there and I've missed it. But I don't think the idea of restricting that the students or other people can't have a car would be a good solution. So perhaps maybe a solution would be, if there's not in the plan now, make a parking structure for those new residents that are coming. That's the question. Will there be a parking structure?
I'm going to let staff respond, and then I'm also going to note that as I flip through the cards, I know that there are at least a couple of folks from the university who have asked to speak, and I'm guessing that they're going to use their time to respond to some of these comments or questions.
Yeah,
and
I don't need an
clarify.
answer at
Yeah.
this point.
All right, so does staff have a quick and easy answer, or?
Yes, there is a proposal to make use of spaces that weren't developed as a part of the 2000 general use permit and have an allowance for asking for permission for another 2,000 spaces as a part of the project if certain conditions are met. So there are some parking requests in the permit application, and those are analyzed in the draft EIR.
So about 2,000 additional spaces, and there's what, 5,100 new resident units? So sounds like it might be a little bit short, but I'm sure you're going to look at it. So that's my comment, basically,
Yeah.
question.
Okay, thank you.
Is there adequate parking? The other was just to follow on from some of the comments earlier. In the decades that I spent in the corporate world, I was always amazed at the differences in business practices here in the U.S. versus abroad. And one of the things we seem to be occupied with is quarterly results and always trying to get to the next quarter without looking at long term. And I think other people have addressed this. So I would just reiterate the fact that maybe one of the things we could do as a community, and I certainly support the Stanford campus and their research and development, is that think about, is there some time when we would say we have enough? And why do we have to continue to grow? why do we have to, at the risk of deteriorating the quality of life, continue to add more and more things to our environment, our living conditions? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. David Milsom, and then Donald Barr. Welcome, Mr. Milsom.
Thank you. My name is David Milsom, and I live in Hanover Street in College Terrace. Near on Stanford, on California Avenue, opposite Columbus, there's a new residential development, and if you trace the route between that and Stanford Avenue, it would go along Columbus, down College, and then on Hanover Street. So, from the point of view of someone living on Hanover Street, I feel a little bit as though I've been thrown under the bus. So I'm concerned about your expressions of mitigation of traffic problems, and I have to tell you that I am very skeptical about whether they're real. And if I'm right in that skepticism, my question really is that you're proposing three different ways of approving this. One is a general way, and then one is building by building, and so on. And my concern is that as this thing develops, we may see a sequence of failure of these traffic mitigation projects and efforts. And I want to be sure, and I think everyone else wants to be sure, that if they do, that there's a way of rolling them back, stopping them, changing them, or doing whatever is necessary to make sure that the traffic impact is not bad for us. So I guess my question is, what sort of incentive does Stanford offer me and anyone else here to go for the general overall permit process rather than a building by building process? Can Stanford give me an assurance, give me faith that if they have a general permit, that we will be able to handle all the problems with traffic that may occur as they develop? Thanks.
Mr. Gerard, comments, if any?
I'll say that any project that's proposed after the general use permit is issued has to be evaluated to make sure that it's consistent with the general use permit. And in some cases, that requires a project-specific transportation study. So if you want to understand the relationship between the programmatic permit and the evaluation of individual projects, the annual reports that are prepared provides a very good connection between the programmatic and the individual project approval process. And
just let me add that the point I'm making is that if things don't go the way
Yes.
they're supposed to,
Yeah.
is there a way of rolling them back and fixing the problems? It seems, what I feel as right now is that once an approval has been made, it gathers a kind of momentum which makes it very, very difficult to stop and make changes.
Mr. Milsom, let me interrupt, and if you stay at the microphone, I'm gonna some of you know, but most of you have no reason to know, I have a background in planning as well, so I have a master's in city planning and the land use law background, and was a certified planner back in a younger time in my life. So I have some experience with planning as a second language, and I'm gonna try and do a little translation here. So let me ask the staff, if 3 years in, it turned out traffic had not been successfully mitigated, that the no net new trips was not being met, which is one of the critical standards here, and there were in fact 20% more new trips during the peak hour, what would the consequences of that be for the university? Mr. Milsom, does that help get us a little closer?
It does.
yeah.
Thanks.
Under the proposed program, they would have to spend more money on more traffic demand management. And if there weren't projects that would reduce the traffic in the area that's been affected, they would have to pay to fix and enlarge intersections and or freeways.
What happens if you can't fix it?
Yeah.
I mean, the point is
Well-
you could create problems that are simply beyond being able to be fixed just because of the number of people and number of trips being taken.
Yep.
Once you have the people in place, then you have the people in place and they are going to make their trips regardless,
Yeah.
right?
I'll say that the short answer is they aren't entitled to additional development unless those impacts are mitigated.
True, but can you ask them to roll back the development that led to the problem that exists?
Point made. Thank you very much. We're going to go on to the next speaker, which is Donald Barr. Mr. Barr, welcome.
Good evening. I'm Donald Barr. I really apologize for wearing all these hats on top of my head. I know it's kind of awkward, but I do wear many hats. And you notice I have a mortarboard first. That's because I am a professor on the faculty at Stanford, and I've been teaching at Stanford for about 25 years. But notice on top of the mortarboard, I also have a Palo Alto Little League hat. I've lived in Palo Alto since 1993, raised 2 children, and I have spent countless hours on the Little League field as both coach and parent rooter. So I am wearing both hats. And that's the point I would actually like to make, is that I'm going to focus on the Community Housing Fund, because as you know, I've worked in the community on affordable housing. The 2000 GUP Community Housing Fund had somewhere between $36 and $39 million, of which it used $13 million for new affordable housing. Fortunately, leaving about 20 some odd million. Fortunately, that was available to preserve Buena Vista Mobile Home Park, but that did not create any new units. But it's because the old model didn't work that the proposal is to expand the area beyond the local 6-mile radius to wherever along the transit corridor. And I'm not sure those housing units are going to go to people affecting the university, because it's our community that's impacted in terms of the service workers both on campus and off campus. All you have to do is go to Trader Joe's and Pete's and University Avenue, and you will see how university growth impacts the service economy. So what I'm simply going to suggest is, rather than saying we're going to scrap the old model, let's look for an innovative approach, the old model, as to how to use the Community Housing Fund, and let's use many hats. Let's buy a new table, and let's put 4 chairs around it, and one of the chairs would be Stanford University representatives, and one of the chairs would be community representatives, city government representatives, and affordable housing representatives. And as a mitigating measure, let's try and find a new, innovative way to use the Community Housing Fund locally, because I think it is possible, but just we need innovative thinking. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Don Price, Wayne Douglas, Caleb Smith, and Catherine Palter. And if we could ask you to come on up. Don Price, Wayne Douglas, come on up all of you please, Caleb Smith, and Catherine Palter. Welcome.
My name is Don Price. I live on Addison Avenue in Palo Alto. I have a very long history of Stanford. I started as a freshman in 1949, and I've studied and had full employment there ever since. I first point out that all of the Stanford staff who have developed these fine plans, brochures, arguments, public relations, they are all employees of Stanford, and the role of an employee at Stanford, the primary role, is to serve the professoriate, to meet the needs of the professors. I have learned that most professors have an insatiable requirement for larger labs, more graduate students, more office space, and so forth. And when they talk about new housing, most of it is going to go to new graduate students in the STEM fields or in the professional schools. In the 1960s, we refer to the period here as the second Stone Age. Well, that Stone Age has never ceased. And now we have a proposal before us, just like the one 20 years ago, to provide housing for new programs, brand new research ideas, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that has to come to an end sometime. Otherwise, in 20 years, we'll have another proposal for another 2 or 3 million square feet of space. And in the meantime, Stanford is building a huge complex in Redwood City that is also going to house thousands of people, too. And I just want to put that on the record.
Thank you for your comments, sir. Wayne Douglas, to be followed by Caleb Smith and Catherine Palter. Let me ask my staff to make sure that the microphone can be adjusted.
Thank you, Joe. Last time I saw you, I was running for office. And I'm in the odd position here of just offering a comment that I support somebody that I never thought I would, and that is Greg Scharf's appeal to the planning department to take a hard look, is the word he described, and you wouldn't write a letter to the planning office if you wanted to do a superficial look, but nevertheless, I agree. The mitigation of traffic and so forth is a very big deal for Greg, and maybe Eric or somebody who's in the audience will tell us what he has in mind, but I'll give you my impression. I think Greg, as the mayor, knows more than I do, and he knows that the city has gone full bore into traffic control management, a phrase that I find abhorrent in the extreme, and he's probably afraid that he's bought into some kind of snake oil, so he wants the planning department to take particularly close scrutiny of it. And I agree with that proposal. It could really be a shock, as we used to say when I was a student protester in the 60s, and it deserves very close scrutiny indeed. I spent 25 years in high tech, and I know buzzwords and gibberish I'm very fluent in, and I know how these things go, and it would be very easy for elected officials to buy into some cockamamie technical scheme that makes no sense at all. So I'll just reiterate what Greg said in his letter to the Planning Division, and take a very, very close look at it. Don't believe everything you read, whether it's in the EIR or not, or whether it comes from a Stanford source or not. You know, make up your own mind. That's what elected officials are supposed to do. And so that's what I urge you to do, Joe. Go at them.
Thank you. I'm tempted to say we're going to dialogue and interface about how we preserve the human scale, but I think that would probably be contrary to your request. Caleb Smith to be followed by Catherine Falter. Mr. Smith, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, Supervisor Simitian, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Caleb Smith. I'm a Bay Area native, and I am currently a master's candidate in public policy at Stanford University. Now, like many members of the Stanford community, I want the university to grow and flourish, but my focus of study is in housing and local government, and I am writing my thesis about the California Environmental Quality Act. And I'm therefore forced to conclude that Stanford's general use permit and the related environmental impact report are both fatally flawed. The underlying issue, I believe, is the method that Stanford used to calculate the growth in the population of students and staff at the university. Although I can understand how trying to use past growth as a measure would be the approach they would take, I believe that they're failing to properly account for recent changes in the composition of the student body, such as the increase in co-terminal master's students at the university. And if you take a look at the square footage to housing unit ratio that the university uses at a little bit more than 800 square feet per housing unit, you see it is considerably higher than the ratios that a number of other universities use around the United States. Now, if we take a look at this ratio and we see it's out of compliance, then we would find that Stanford is going to most likely have more students and staff than it's currently projecting, which means that the housing mitigation measures it proposes are inadequate to the task. I would further be concerned that the university's measures to ensure that there's an adequate supply of affordable housing are not up to the task. You may recall under the current general use permit that some of the graduate student housing residences on campus, such as Munger, are being used as affordable housing. However, the university has failed to do one of the most basic things you do when you operate affordable housing, which is to verify the income of the residents to make sure they are indeed low income. Now, I'd say a vast majority of Stanford graduate students are low income, but there are some that are not, perhaps some of the graduate school of business students and law students and such. And it's important that Stanford fully mitigate the affordable housing impacts of its new developments. Now, these affordable housing developments they were able to use with graduate students enabled Stanford if they were to instead mitigate it using a similar fee to the amount that they spend per unit, it would have been a considerable amount of money, upwards of $30 million. I understand that that's different, where they have the amount that they would pay versus the amount of affordable housing on campus. However, if we're trying to look in totality at its efforts to mitigate the affordable housing demand, I don't think that what they're proposing is up to the job. Now, this is very important because it would be a significant impact under the California Environmental Quality Act if it causes displacement, which causes new housing construction elsewhere in the Bay Area, and unless this plan is modified to either increase the amount of housing involved or to reduce the amount of new development, I believe it will have this impact, which is not properly accounted for in the environmental impact report, which would further aggravate the jobs to housing imbalance that is plaguing our region. And indeed, I believe would make the environmental impact report subject to a possible legal challenge. Now, I trust in your judgment to work with Stanford to find a solution to this challenge. And if there's any way I can be of assistance, I'd more than be happy to do so.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your comments. That takes us to Catherine Palter, and Ms. Palter will be followed by Geraldine Moran, Bing Heckman, Steve Woodward, and Rita. I haven't got a clue. I apologize. Yes, thank you. So Ms. Palter, if you'll go ahead, and then if the other four would line up behind you so we can move right along. Welcome.
Great, thank you. My name's Catherine Palter. I'm with Stanford's Land Use and Environmental Planning Office. When Stanford pulled together its application in the fall, requesting a certain amount of academic and housing, we did a lot of our own due diligence to try to determine what sort of environmental impacts that development could cause in order to build some mitigating factors into our application. And we were very gratified to see in the draft environmental impact report that's recently prepared by the county that all of those efforts bore a lot of fruit. There was a high-level analysis of the analysis that was done. There's about 16 environmental resource areas that are analyzed in the DEIR. Each of those has a number of sub-areas that looked at potential impacts that the project could cause. All in all, there's 80 different environmental impacts that are associated with the project. Of those, 47 were found to be less than significant, and another 29 were considered less than significant after the identified mitigation would be implemented, which leaves 4 impacts that are considered significant and unavoidable. And all of those are a somewhat conservative analysis because it's not known whether they may or may not occur. The first is potential impacts to historic resources, which in the future, Stanford may need to demolish a historic resource to replace it with a more state-of-the-art building. We don't know if that's going to happen. It only happened once in the 2000 general use permit. The other is construction noise. There might be times if the construction noise is adjacent to a sensitive receptor and the noise mitigation doesn't take away to a less than significant level, there may be a temporary exceedance and a significant impact. The other 2 are related to transportation, and they are both at intersections and on the freeway, and it's with the assumption that the no net new commute trips won't be successful. And so that it is a conservative analysis because we fully intend for that to work, in which case those significant impacts would go away. The EIR also always thinks about detriments, to trying to minimize detriments to the environment. There's actually 3 areas kind of buried in the EIR where the environment actually gets better in 2035 with the implementation of the project, and that's in the areas of criteria air pollutants, vehicle miles traveled, and greenhouse gas emissions. So I know that 2 million square feet and 3,000 housing units over a period of 17 years can feel like a lot of development, and they're feeling that there must be impacts, but I urge everyone to review this very rigorous study that was done to see that Stanford has a unique opportunity to address its impacts in a comprehensive way, in a very successful way, and we have a track record of doing it since 2000. I also I hear a number of comments about the feasibility of no net new commute trips, and I do have some additional information. I don't know if you could allow me a little bit more time to go to that, if that would be okay.
Briefly, please.
We have heard people say that they don't believe that Stanford can achieve no net new trips going forward, and it's a very understandable question. We had it ourselves before we even made our application, wanting to know if we could actually make that commitment to do no net new commute trips. So we hired some expert transportation consultants, Arup, Fair and Piers, and Alta, and they created a mode share model for us that looked at the traffic model and integrated the commute survey data we have for our own people. And that allowed us to see that we could feasibly add more programs to get the needed people out of their cars and meet that standard moving forward. It's also a model we're going to be using in the future to figure out, as we move forward, what's the most efficient way to get additional peak hour commuters out of their cars. The way the math works is that we have about 3,000 peak hour commuters coming to campus every day. It's about the same amount that we had in 2000. The EIR found that there's going to be about 780 new peak hour commuters if we're not successful with no net new commute trips. That's about 45 to 50 new peak hour commuters each year. So we would be looking at our pool of about 3,000 people and saying, what program could we add that could get 50 people off this year? And it might be a program like improving bike infrastructure around the campus, which our model says could take 80 to 90 people off that year and every year moving forward. It might be a new express bus that takes 30 to 40 people off each year from that bus. Okay, so I just wanted to say that this is not something that Stanford took lightly just to say that we thought we could do it. We did a very rigorous analysis to say that. And if anyone has more questions about it, I'm happy to talk about it after. Thank you for allowing me the extra time.
Thank you. Geraldine Moran, Bing Heckman, Steve Woodward, and Rita, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for listening to all of us tonight. I'll be very brief. My name is Geraldine Moran. I'm a resident here in Palo Alto. I'm very concerned about climate change and the commitments our city has made. This is a huge thing, and Stanford needs to address this more aggressively. In reviewing the EIR, I don't see the mitigation meeting that need in housing or transportation. And this is critical. It's time sensitive, and I just don't see it being addressed properly. I really implore you to step back and take a hard look at that, because we don't have time to do it wrong this time. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, and I apologize, I think I mispronounced your name. So, Bing Heckman, you're up next.
Good evening, and thank you, Supervisor Simitian. We appreciate your good service. And I must say first, I'm not well informed in all this. It's my first exposure to it. I do plan to look into it further, but I have a couple of questions. One is, I'd be curious to know more about how many Stanford students, graduate, undergraduate, live off campus, and if more housing were built to accommodate them, freeing up housing off campus, that might be a way to mitigate housing impacts further. I don't believe that would really affect peak traffic, because I don't think those people really hit the peak traffic times in corridors. But another thought might be interesting to explore would be, since Stanford already owns the land, they could feasibly, profitably develop housing that might accommodate Stanford employees. Perhaps I might even expand that to teachers and first responders. That would both free up housing and perhaps mitigate traffic impacts, as those people would then live closer to where they work. So it's just a couple of thoughts might be interesting to explore. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also appreciate the GUP process, and thank you for going through that for everyone.
Thank you. Steve Woodward, to be followed by Rita, or perhaps
Or Rita first.
And Rita, forgive me,
Okay.
your last name again is?
Varel,
Please spell.
V-R-H-E-L.
V-E-R?
No, V-R-H-E-L.
Got it. I just want to make sure we have it
Okay.
right for the record. Thank you.
So, if you're hearing a little bit of dismay or disbelief from the good citizens of Palo Alto, it's because we've been through this. We have heard for years, as Greg Schmidt always said, traffic is cumulative, but we keep looking at each individual project and going, oh my God, there's no impact. This is wonderful. But then you see our streets and our intersections, and they're awful. So no, we don't believe there's not going to be any impact. And the woman who spoke about traffic mitigation was a wonderful speaker. But, honestly, I don't believe any of it, because what we've been told by our city council is that there's no impact. There's no impact of everything that goes in, except then there is. And yes, Stanford is doing a lot of building right now, which has not been completed. So we really don't know the impacts of
what the no impacts are going to be. So we're very skeptical. And I applaud everybody who has come tonight and is skeptical. And I would invite them to come to the 10/23 at about 7 p.m. City Council meeting and speak to your concerns to the City Council about the gutted comprehensive plan. Because if Stanford's growing and Palo Alto is growing and nobody's happy with it, everybody has to speak up before it happens. Now, I had couple other comments, and thank you for letting me do my advertisement. So that they were talking about 9,600 new graduate students and faculty. Are these people all coming by themselves? No one has a spouse or children? So what is the actual number? And I don't know if that's the 9,600 or if we get to add more to that. Whatever you get to add to it or not add to it, the amount of housing that you are proposing definitely is not adequate. And what that means is that you're going to push these people, all of them who are, I'm sure, very nice, into the Palo Alto housing market, which we all know is the whole Bay Area has a problem with housing, and the City Council is working hard to address that. The other thing is, you know, we have a water problem in California. I'm a member of Save Palo Alto's groundwater.org, and at a recent San Mateo County water meeting, I asked point blank one of the fellows at Stanford who's in charge of water if he would entertain the thought of San Mateo County and Palo Alto being allowed to recharge groundwater on Stanford land. And without a nanosecond, he said no. So I think if Stanford's going to build more and take more groundwater from the good city, then I think they have to entertain the idea of being generous with their land and allowing for groundwater recharge. The other thing is, where are these children going to be schooled? I think we have a big problem in Palo Alto right now, as if you've read the newspapers. So I would hope that Stanford would, I don't know how it works. I know back east they don't pay any, schools don't pay anything for educating their kids. I would hope that they would make allowances so that they would pay to educate their children. Also, I hope that they also build parks and recreational facilities on Stanford land, because we're getting crowded in Palo Alto. I think that's all I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me turn to staff and see if either the staff or our consulting team can perhaps break down a little more clearly or fully who those 9,600 folks are, so that people have a better understanding of that.
These are for the residential population on the campus. As of 2035, and the details can be found in table 5.12-10. But non-student spouses and children are figured into the total. They are, or that it breaks out the population in students and spouses and children.
All right. Mr. Woodward?
Thank you. I heard a lot of enthusiasm in the room for the notion of a maximum build-out plan. So I'd like to ask if the approval of the current proposal can be made contingent on the creation and publication of such a plan.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, this was, there was a condition built into the 2000 GUP and community plan that required for a sustainable development study, and I'm going to read the language one more time. Please bear with me. The requirement of the existing plan approved in 2000 was that a sustainable development study shall identify the maximum plan build-out potential for all of Stanford's unincorporated Santa Clara County land. There was a sustainable development study. It was approved, I believe, 3-2 by the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors in 2009, when I was not there, just to be clear. And it is my judgment that the requirements of the 2000 GUP and community plan were not satisfied by the adopted sustainable development study. That obviously is a point of view which the university, I suspect, does not share. We've had conversations about that, and the question, separate and apart from the draft EIR and the application, is where are we in that process? And you've raised what I'll call yet another question, which is, all right, we know what happened and what didn't, but what happens now going forward in this plan, and then perhaps, the issue can be revisited, as I say, as part of this application, but also separate and apart with respect to what happened back in 2000.
So are there other things that citizens can do to ensure that county government is not stiffed, as it were, on the provision of such a plan?
You can comment on that issue as part of the draft EIR comment process, which is what you are doing even as you speak, or even as I speak in response. And anyone else who wishes to speak to that issue certainly may. Anyone who wishes to provide written comments on that issue, one way or the other, certainly may. For those of you who are wondering sort of what this is about, the way our county zoning works on the Stanford campus for most of these lands, and again, I'll turn to staff in a minute to correct me if I'm wrong, is a little different than what we're used to in a typical city setting. So if I were to talk to one of the council members who was here and we were to walk downtown and walk 5 blocks by 2 blocks and figure, all right, now I've got 10 square blocks of downtown development, I could look at the community general plan, then I could look at the zoning, and if I knew what the maximum development pursuant to the zoning was and what the floor area ratio was, I could do some relatively simple math and say, here's the maximum development at build out in those 10 square blocks. With me so far? Mm-hmm. That is not possible on much of the Stanford campus because the zoning we have is, I believe, A1, if I remember correctly. And A1 says, whatever you build, it's got to be consistent with the community plan and the GUP, but it doesn't lay out the kind of boundaries that I just described that you would find in a more conventional urban plan. Now, there are supporters and detractors of this approach. Some would say, well, look, you get to approve every single project or deny it. So you have ultimate control because you can vote a project up or down. Others would say it provides no maximum build-out if, as some suggest, the applicant can come back every 15 years and say we'd like another couple million square feet. Supporters of the current approach would also say, however, look, having that flexibility is good because when we come, again, you can vote it down if you want to, but as long as we're putting an application in the process that is consistent with the community plan and the GUP, what's the problem? And then we're in a circular argument because the answer somebody would give is, the problem is there's never any end to this. This was the debate we had 17, 18 years ago, which is why the document that we approved at the time called for a sustainable development study to address this issue, which is why you hear just a little bit of frustration in my voice that here we are again having a similar conversation.
Right. Well, I mean, it is
And hang on a second, I want to check with the county staff. If I've said anything factually incorrect, understanding you're not going to want to get in the middle of this policy discussion.
You were factually accurate, yes.
All right, good.
Well, I would just make the point that at the university's published rate of growth of 1.2% per year, it will in 60 years be twice as big as it is now. And so, the conversations are going to happen.
All right. I think we're at the 3-minute point, and thank you, and I hope my comments clarified rather than confused the nature of the debate. That takes us to Alice Kaufman, Jean McCown, C. Reddy, and Mary O'Kickey. Come on up. Alice Kaufman, Jean McCown, C. Reddy, and Mary O'Kickey. And thank you all for hanging in with us.
Good evening, Supervisor Simitian. Thank you for holding this meeting. My name is Alice Kaufman. I'm with Committee for Green Foothills. We're an environmental organization working to protect open space and natural resources in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties. As an open space organization, we're concerned about the potential of sprawl development into open space areas. sustainable development is not just about water and energy conservation, waste reduction, and TDM programs, it's also about managed growth. Unchecked growth is what we had during the 1950s, when what used to be called the Valley of Heart's Delight was turned into miles upon miles of suburban sprawl. This kind of growth not only eats up open space, it uses more energy, creates more pollution, and makes transportation problems worse. Now, when the Stanford Community Plan was approved in the year 2000, it established an academic growth boundary, or AGB, which was intended to prevent this type of sprawl development into the open space of the foothills. Under the AGB, Stanford's development would remain within this boundary, and the AGB is, she's asking me to slow down. The AGB is protected, this is what happens when I type out my comments ahead of time. It's protected by the requirement of a 4/5 supermajority vote of the Board of Supervisors in order to change it. Now, the Committee for Green Foothills, we're very pleased that Stanford is now proposing changes to the academic growth boundary. However, the supermajority requirement for changing the AGB was only established for a period of 25 years, which means that it expires in 2025. And we'd like to propose that this supermajority requirement be extended for another 25 years. I'd like to point out this is not just about preserving landscapes for recreation and wildlife, it's also about climate change. The state of California's policy on preservation of natural and working lands meaning agricultural and ranch land, states in part, California's climate objective for natural and working lands is to maintain them as a carbon sink, i.e. net zero or even negative greenhouse gas emissions. And Santa Clara County recently declared its support for the Paris Climate Agreement and pledged to lead the way in reducing greenhouse gases and combating climate change. We can't reach our climate change goals merely by driving electric cars and building LEED certified buildings if we do nothing to prevent sprawl into open space. And I'd also like to comment that the discussion about maximum build-out is also relevant to this issue, because it's the development pressures, it's the belief that there needs to be further growth that creates the perceived need for development into open space. So for people who are concerned about that issue, this should be a concern of yours as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And you fit in 3 minutes even more slowly, so good for you. Thank you very much. Jean McCown, to be followed by C. Reddy and Mary O'Kickey. Ms. McCown?
Thank you very much. Excuse me, Jean McCown, Stanford University. I'm in the Government and Community Relations Office. First, I want to very briefly thank county staff, including Supervisor Simitian, for the devotion of many hours already this week in doing these types of meetings in the community. This is the third night out for all of you and all of us, and there's at least a half a dozen more of those coming up in other jurisdictions. It's
good to see you again, Ms. McGowan.
The relationship between Stanford and the county is, as Joe said, we're the applicant, the county is the ultimate decision maker. But we are absolutely aligned on the commitment to providing the facts and the analysis to assist in the public's understanding and participation in this process. And that is clearly the intent of this draft environmental impact report. We want that information to be available and accessible for those that want to learn more about how these impacts are addressed and in a variety of forms. Now that's quite challenging. The document, many of you may not have seen it yet, it's approaching 1,000 pages, covering all of those issues that were shown up on the screen. But we would encourage people to go in and find the sections that are of particular interest. So, many of the comments and questions made this evening are addressed in the document, and answers are given to some of the concerns that have been expressed. That's the way the responses to these comments will respond to demonstrate whether those issues have been taken care of or how they've been addressed. One quick example I'll give before closing is Alice Smith made the question about whether there's going to be runoff, stormwater runoff off the campus because of additional development. There's a whole section in the document that talks about that, talks about how stormwater retention will be maintained on campus so that there wouldn't be any allowed runoff. So that's just one short example of where concerns that people have expressed, understandably, because the document's only been out for 10 days. I would be surprised. Some of you may have looked at it, but probably most people have not had a chance. And I would just encourage people to use the county's website, go find the section that's of particular interest, take a look at what is it saying on that topic. Make your comments if you don't think it's adequate, as Joe said. We're very interested in hearing these conversations. We welcome you offering them directly to the university as well as through the formal county process. So a lot of you know how to reach me, and I'm more than willing to engage in those individual conversations.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And for those who are watching, I neglected to turn on the 3-minute light, but Ms. McCown is a practiced public speaker and I think was pretty much spot on. So thank you for that as well. Let me just look to my staff. For those who find the planning site a little more difficult to access, we'll have an easy access portal on my website. So if it's easier for you to just go Supervisor Simitian and pop it into your search, feel free, and that may give you a more intuitive path or not, depending. C. Reddy, followed by Mary O'Kickey, and then we'll start another batch of 4. Mr. Reddy, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, Supervisor Simitian and Mr. Gerard. I've seen you come speak a couple of days ago in another meeting, and I'm going to repeat for the audience that are listening to us. I honestly think that the Stanford GUP proposal is not innovative enough. For the national interest, we are Stanford, we are Palo Alto, we are the best that we can offer to the country and to the world. We are still not cancer-free. We need research. We are still not gasoline engine-free. We still need research. So I think we need to go be more innovative, and we need to educate. Stanford needs to take on like what we did in 1994 to 2015. We helped build the internet. We helped populate the world with all the information. We need to do the same thing. I think Stanford I would recommend Stanford to look for a 50,000 campus. It doesn't have to be in Palo Alto. It could be East Palo Alto, somewhere else on the Bay, somewhere else, another part of the world. But I think it's short-sightedness for 6,000 square foot home, and I have it, this is my home, and I have to see the traffic. I think we need to get beyond that and look for the national interest so we don't get hit by North Korea and Chinese and the Japanese, and not Japanese, but right now we have a lot of threat. We need to be able to survive in this world. And the biggest challenge is the traffic and the gasoline engines. We have Elon Musk sitting next door, literally about 2 miles away. We need to get more creative and to move the people around. I was in Switzerland 2 months ago. There's a lot of moving people. Frankfurt, you have, London. There is a lot of innovative aspects. We all need to get together and move people, not with one person sitting in a Tesla or any SUV with 6 people space, but there's only one person. So I think we need to think better, think innovative, and that's not in this plan. This is just a patchwork. I think we should do better. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Mary O'Kickey, and then we will go to the next 4, which will be Hal Mickelson, Eric Filseth, Stephanie Munoz, and Arthur Keller in that order. Ms. O'Kickey, welcome. Mr. Moss, I'm going to do 2 things. First, I'm going to ask you not to shout out from the audience again. Second, I'm going to tell you, as I told everyone earlier this evening, I have shuffled the cards, and I shuffled the cards for a very deliberate reason, which is to prevent folks from gaming the system by arriving early and turning a half-dozen cards in or putting them all in one particular order. So it's on me to be the shuffler of cards, and I have shuffled those cards very deliberately and with that intent to make sure that it is as close to random as possible. There you go. Ms. O'Kickey.
Hi, thank you. So I'm Mary O'Kickey, and I am both a homeowner and a resident of Palo Alto. And first, I would like to commend Stanford on its green building initiatives. Both the Y2E2 building and the SESI project are truly outstanding ones. But I do think I'm going to sound redundant here. I don't think there's a way to overstate the housing crisis, and I would like to see Stanford make the commitment to give 100% housing to its graduate students. Just today, I was talking to my neighbor, and she told me about a graduate student she knows who's living in a van on campus because she can't find affordable housing. I am supportive of increasing the undergraduate class population. Stanford is an amazing resource, and I think providing access to that resource to more young people is a lofty goal. However, I can't be supportive of increasing the total research facilities if it's going to increase the graduate population. So even if you increase graduate housing, but if you don't end up increasing it enough, you're still just going to overall add to the graduate homeless population. So that's what I'd like to see, is a commitment from Stanford for graduate housing. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And Mr. Mickelson, you're up first in this next batch of 4, but don't rush because I want to do a quick poll of the audience before we lose any more of you. If we schedule subsequent meetings, there's always the question of what's the best time to schedule the meeting on a weeknight. There is no perfect time, I have discovered over the years, but if we were choosing between 6 o'clock as a start time and 7 o'clock as a start time, let me just ask, how many of you would prefer 6 o'clock as a start time? And how many of you would have preferred 7 o'clock as a start time? And now you know why it's a difficult decision. All right. Thank you. Mr. Mickelson, welcome. It's nice to see you, sir.
I'm Hal Mickelson. I'm a resident of Palo Alto. I've lived in Santa Clara County since 1975 and in the city of Palo Alto since 1982. I'm strongly in support of Stanford's application. We sometimes forget here in Silicon Valley just how lucky we are. We have daily reminders of a lot of our good luck, but we sometimes lose perspective. If we were in almost any other part of the country, talking about almost any other college or university needing to expand, we would be talking about the college or university gobbling up existing housing, having to invade neighborhoods on its boundaries. And the mitigation we would be discussing would be a mitigation of the housing units that were destroyed by the growth of those colleges and universities. Just look at the map of places like Harvard and the University of Chicago and Caltech down in Pasadena. They can't grow without absorbing some of the housing next to them through good planning, through foresight. Stanford is able to do these things without encroaching on the adjoining community. The main point I would make is that a key to a great many of the proposed mitigations is traffic demand management, and in that area, I would point out that Stanford has been notably successful. Its traffic demand management program, its Marguerite Shuttle program are examples to the whole country of how this can be done right. I've heard several speakers say, they doubt that traffic demand management can do the job. They doubt that it's feasible. I think we have to look at facts. We have to look at numbers. We have to look at the numbers that Stanford can show of the success that it has had in encouraging commute alternatives and traffic demand management. I think its performance has been admirable. So in short, I'm one of the people who believe that Stanford has been a good neighbor, that it has been consistently responsible in dealing with the communities around it, and I think it's earned credibility when it talks about the steps that it would take by way of mitigation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mickelson. Eric Filseth to be followed by Stephanie Munoz to be followed by Arthur Keller. Come on up.
I guess this is the town gown discussion, right, as we're having here, is it? I'm Eric Filseth, resident of Palo Alto, and with the observation, among others, that environmental degradation tends to follow human activity around, I guess I'd like to add my voice to those calling for clarity on what the max build-out is going to look like. And I gather that last time, in 2000, we proceeded with the previous GUP with a plan to define that, and for one reason or another, it didn't really come together. And seems like this time around, it would be, given that history, it'd be nice to see the max build-out plan before the GUP proceeds. And I assume that would cover some disposition of what's going to happen to the open space that we have now. The other issue that I want to talk about is a little bit of a hand wave, but The GUP calls for, basically 2,000 faculty and postdocs and up to 2,000 other various staff, some of which are part-time, I understand, and 550 housing units for that cohort. And the long-term housing growth in Palo Alto, it's been pretty consistent for decades now, somewhere between 100 and 200 units a year. And a year or two ago, we established a non-residential growth limit of 50,000 square feet a year in town. And so here's the hand wave, and this is very hand wavy, and it relies on some definitional assumptions too, as well as what about the research park and so forth, right? But if you look at it sideways, to first order, if you do the arithmetic, right, you can make a case that the city of Palo Alto is housing its entire non-residential expansion. And so you can't say that about the Stanford plan. So with that as an existence proof, I'd urge Stanford to take another shot at that, because the benefits in terms of both housing and, of course, secondary things like traffic and so forth would be positive. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Council Member. Stephanie Munoz to be followed by Arthur Keller. Ms. Munoz. And that microphone will come down. There you go.
I'm here to speak in behalf of somebody who hasn't been heard of for a long time. The woman's name was Jane Stanford, and she was married to one of the most powerful men in the world, Senator Leland Stanford, also governor of this state. Extremely wealthy, extremely powerful, and perhaps not too well loved by the people who felt the burden of being under the thumb of the Southern Pacific Railway. It was her intention to make the world a better place, and she'd been taught, like other women of our generation, that she could do that to her children, and so she decided she would raise a paragon. She would rear a child who would be fit to govern. He would know all about countries in the world, and all about the culture, and all about what made life worth living, and he'd put it all into California. And then he died. Stanford is a memorial. It's like those memorial chapels in the cathedrals in Europe. It's meant to take the place of that kid that Mrs. Stanford wanted to be the best person in the world to govern. It was not meant to be an engine to make more wealth. They already had made wealth, lots of it. This was for the poor boys of California and the poor girls, sort of an afterthought, to make it a better place to live. I submit that the reform back in the 50s and 60s in response to the Russian Sputnik advance, which seemed to put the United States in the shade, was not what she had in mind. And you have to remember that the Palo Alto that had been made as a town just for a backup for this university had housing in the Stanford foothills, and that changed. The housing was removed, and the knowledge factories were put in, and we have had a housing shortage ever since. The man who preceded me by a couple of places spoke about Harvard's gobbling up, well, they do, half of Cambridge. But Stanford did too. The people who worked at Stanford, and we're not talking about the students, because the students always did live in Palo Alto. My mom had students when we were kids. But the grown-ups, the workers that lived there, had to live in Menlo Park, and Palo Alto, and Mountain View, and every place. And it's going on like that. All I ask you is, please, do not let Stanford build as much work as it wishes. Only have housing for every worker.
Thank you, Ms. Munoz.
You're welcome.
Arthur Keller, and then we're going to be followed by the following four folks: Sandy Sloan, Bob Moss, Penny Ellison, and Terry Holzmer. And I'm going to stop that. You're right, that flashing red light doesn't do you any good. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Supervisor Simitian and staff. I think that Stanford is a great institution. However, too much of a great or good thing is not good also. And as those of us who have eaten a little bit too much know about. I also align myself with those who think that the missing carrying capacity study for Stanford should be put as part of the approval, should be required as part of the approval process for the general use permit. Now, I know that you expounded on the issue of how such approvals are done, but let me give my understanding, which you can correct if after I speak if I'm wrong, and that is that the EIR goes according to a state-regulated process, but the general use permit is a discretionary permit, and therefore the county can, as it wishes, impose whatever rules are appropriate through appropriate nexus on Stanford that makes sense. So with that being said, I indicate that we do have some flexibility in terms of impositions on Stanford. So the first thing is that Stanford, and they did something very innovative and very successful in terms of the new net trips limitation on traffic. However, that limitation is being somewhat relaxed in the EIR process with indulgences, paying for mitigations in the city and then mitigations beyond that if they don't succeed. And I think that the indulgences process of paying for that is a problem. And also part of the issue is that Stanford employment has impacted with parking in the city. That we noticed that with terms of the College Terrace parking permit process that displaced a bunch of cars that would have been there, now they're elsewhere. Because the reliance on the no new net trips is in fact on the increase of Caltrain, Stanford should contribute towards Caltrain grade separations. The jobs housing ratio for Palo Alto, for Stanford is worse than Palo Alto's. We should include a outcome measure that it not get worse, that it in fact get better, that Stanford house all of its undergraduates, graduate students, and postdocs in order to avoid displacing them to outside. We should think about, because Stanford lands for most of its housing does not pay property taxes, there will be no contribution to Palo Alto Unified School District for the increase of school population, and therefore Stanford should be providing land for the increase of school population that's projected because for schools. And I do note that Stanford used to house Stanford Elementary School, which is where this Stanford housing is going on now, so we should do that.
And wrapping up, please.
And finally, we should think in terms of upstream flood control protection provided for San Francisco Creek as part of this, and I think an appropriate nexus can be made. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Sandy Sloan, Bob Moss, Penny Ellison, and Terry Holzmer. Ms. Sloan may have left. All right, Mr. Moss, you're up. Followed by Penny Ellison, followed by Terry Holzmer.
Thank you, Joe. First, one of the concerns that we obviously have is that Stanford has not been responsive to questions asked by the community and by the Board of Supervisors. So I would suggest that when an approval of new development is given, there be a requirement that Stanford has to satisfy all questions and requests proposed by both the city and the Board of Supervisors, such as what is the build-out potential for the site. If they don't answer them satisfactorily, no building permit. That might get their attention. One of the concerns I have, and this isn't just Stanford, it's in general in development, is they tend to look only at their own site and not at what's happening around them. Both Menlo Park and Palo Alto have continued to develop. Menlo Park is being asked, for example, to increase the number of residential units significantly. Palo Alto adds between 50 and 100,000 square feet of commercial space every year. They've been doing that for years, and hundreds of housing units. All that has an impact on traffic, and how that interacts with traffic at Stanford should be looked at. For example, the most congested intersection in Palo Alto is El Camino and Page Mill. And also Page Mill and Foothill, and El Camino and Embarcadero. Those are all right around Stanford. So Stanford is complying on campus, perhaps, but they're not necessarily complying with the overall area. Stanford has an interesting way of addressing traffic problems. About 10 or 12 years ago, I had a contract for one of the organizations at Stanford, and they said, don't come on campus before 10 o'clock in the morning. And when you leave before 3 or 3:30, so you don't count in the peak traffic hours. So you should be taking a look at all the traffic that goes in and out of Stanford all day. Now, one of the other issues is, how do we verify that the mitigations actually are working? Well, they're not going to, if you approve all 2.25 million square feet, they're not going to build it all at once. So I would suggest that incrementally, say every 500,000 square feet, you verify that the mitigations have in fact happened and been consistent with what was promised. If they haven't been, then they can't continue building. That will give them an incentive and also give you a quantitative way of verifying that mitigations happen. Otherwise, we have no way of controlling it, and you have no way of knowing what's going on.
Thank you. Penny Elson to be followed by Terry Holzmer. And if Terry Holzmer is here, please come on down so that you're teed up.
Good evening, and thank you for holding this meeting. It's great to have an opportunity to have a community conversation about this. I haven't had a chance to get through the voluminous DEIR yet, but I have a few comments just on the summary that I've read and some things that I've heard this evening. This week I had 2 interactions with Stanford that I'd like to relate a little bit about. I attended the Stanford Safe Routes to Everywhere meeting yesterday, and also had the opportunity to see their new report, the Stanford Bicycle Commuter Access Study, and I was heartened to see a vision for partnering with neighboring jurisdictions to support bicycling investments to improve local and regional connectivity, and I hope I'll find appropriate mitigations laid out in the DEIR that'll serve to implement that vision. According to the Stanford study, 21% of Stanford commuters choose to bike, 17% use Caltrain, 43% are still driving alone. It's that last figure that worries me. Stanford is building for, I think you said tonight, 9,000 something.
9,600.
Thank you. New people. And I think I read that there's a little over 3,000 new, net new on-campus housing units and beds.
3,150.
Thank you, Joe. You're so good with the numbers. Okay, that is. So, conservatively, I mean, I'm not even going to estimate the thousands of new drivers we're talking about here in town, but as a former Safe Routes to School mom, this worries me. It's the cars that are the problem getting people on bikes, and we're going to have to manage that. Stanford has done a wonderful job with your TDM program, but at 21%, you guys are leveling out. You're going to have to really step it up. And I know, I've done this work. It's hard. It's hard with kids who want to ride. It's harder with grown-ups who are stuck in a rut. So I'm going to be very interested to read the transportation section of this. And I just want to say that I hope what I'm going to find in there is a really robust, new, stronger TDM program. And then the second thing I wanted to relate is a story, really quick. I had a visiting cousin from another university that will remain unnamed, much less prestigious than Stanford, came to visit this week. And I gave him, it was his first time in Palo Alto, so I gave him a quick tour of the Stanford campus, and he was stunned to see the amount of land on the campus, because he has had grad students and postdoc students come to his university because of the lack of housing. They would probably live in a trailer for themselves, but they're not going to put their wife and their kids there. So I have to wonder, why Stanford is not providing housing for these lower income participants in your community. And I hope you'll think about that carefully, because I think it's probably having an effect on your school. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Terry Holsmer, and then we will go to Gabby Badika, Priya Graves, Nelson Eng, and Dan Sakaguchi. And for those of you who are wondering, the end is in sight. So thank you. Welcome.
Okay. Good evening. I've been a resident of Palo Alto for over 20 years, and I live in the California Avenue area. And I'd just like to say I'm impacted almost daily by what happens at Stanford University. I guess I'm adding my voice to those people who say, how much growth is enough? And the impacts that I see every day are not only in traffic and housing, but I also see the impacts in just the normal congestion that people feel when they feel like they're surrounded instead every day by thousands of people coming and going, going through various lanes of traffic, but also just walking down the street. You can't go down at 5 p.m. At Embarcadero Road and El Camino and not see tremendous impacts of what Stanford is presenting to the city of Palo Alto.
If I could ask you to pause for just a moment.
Yes.
Could we ask the folks at the back to step out for the conversation? The acoustics are surprisingly good at sending other conversations forward, even if we can't always hear the people at the podium for some reason. So thank you. Go right ahead. We've stopped your time.
Those are my general comments, but I have two specific issues that I think are important for the EIR development. And one is housing. Housing is a wonderful concept, and we need more of it. However, we don't have enough of below-rate market housing. And I'd like to see in this EIR at least a plan from Stanford that they're going to add more below-market rate housing, not necessarily for graduate students, which is wonderful, and I have nothing against graduate students, but for their staff. And the reason I say for staff is because I've read some studies recently, and one of the studies I read said that for every student that goes to a university, there's at least 2.3 of staff needed to support that student. So that means double the amount of room that you need for staff. And you need below-rate market housing on Stanford campus to support those students. If you're going to add more students, then you need more housing on campus. My second point is really quick, and that's about fire protection. As we well know in the North Bay, we've had a tremendous problem with fire. And so I recently watched our own city council deal severely with their own fire protection, I won't say crisis, but challenges that they have. And one thing I noticed in their debate, their discussions, was the fact that Stanford has reduced the amount of money they're paying the city of Palo Alto for fire protection. I think that's appalling. If you're going to add more people, more facilities on campus, then you definitely need more fire protection. And you need to pay for it. If you want Palo Alto to pony up, then you need to support us. This is the citizens that live here. We need better Stanford support for our firemen, for our fire protection, and definitely for all the facilities that go with it. We need more support from Stanford to support the city of Palo Alto. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments. Priya Graves, and then Nelson Eng, and then Dan Sakaguchi.
Good evening. Thank you very much for hosting this evening. First, I wanted to thank Supervisor Simitian for reinforcing my memory that the sustainability plan was supposed to include full build-out plans. This is a finite earth, and we can't keep growing forever. So I'm pleased to hear that that's back on the table, and I would like to see that made a condition of approval of the GUP. Second, I have a couple comments about the traffic. First of all, the no net new trips for a peak hour in the morning and the evening, that doesn't cut it anymore. The peak hour has expanded to be a peak 3 or 4 hours each end of the day, and traffic all day, all night is getting worse and worse. Added to that is the fact that Stanford has added a lot of new sporting events. They are hosting the earthquakes. All of those bring a lot of trips into the area, and I'm more concerned about the greenhouse gases generated from that, and I don't see that particularly covered anywhere in the environmental impact report, although I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing. A comment about the VMT, vehicle miles traveled, analysis, and that is the fact that it treats differently a new faculty or staff person living on campus versus one who's not. So I live in College Terrace. On one side of Stanford Avenue is Stanford housing. On the other side of Stanford Avenue are a number of homes owned by Stanford, which are likely to be occupied by the same kind of people. The fact that the other trips not to work and back, but the rest of the family trips to the grocery store and so forth are not included in the VMT calculation if they happen to live across the street in College Terrace is absurd. So I would tag on to what was said about fire danger with the recent fires up north. I am very concerned that Stanford should not be shooting off fireworks during drought periods. During high wind periods, we have an increasing number of high wind events going on here. And if we get those eucalyptus trees, which I love dearly, in flames, we're all going to go up. We've seen what happened in Napa and Sonoma, and we don't need that happening here. Finally, I'd like to request that perhaps a copy of the EIR could be placed at the College Terrace Library as well, since that's a neighborhood that is very, very much impacted by anything Stanford does. And if I got to go read 1,000 pages or so of environmental impact report, I'd really like to do it so I don't have to bike halfway across town. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And let me just make sure before I ask Nelson Eng to begin. Gabby, Badika, did we get you? We did. Yes? Thank you.
You want to go?
All right. You all are so polite. Thank you. Nelson Eng to be followed by Gabby Badika to be followed by Dan Sakaguchi, and I apologize for skipping over one.
Hi, my name is Nelson Eng. I live at 1260 Emerson Street in Palo Alto, which is about 5 minutes walk to Town Country. The reason I say walk is because I have front row seats to the traffic congestion on Embarcadero, so driving over there, I'm not sure how long it will take. In addition, I also worked on Hillview in Stanford Research Park after I graduated in 1983, and also most recently, the last 2 years, on Deer Creek Road, again in Stanford Research Park. And the traffic pattern is stunning, that the contrast. Basically, I cannot drive there anymore. I shouldn't be. So I've been biking to work, and then I really feel sorry for the people, the miles of congestion coming up down on Page Mill. So having said that, it's just that currently the traffic in Palo Alto is unbearable. I hope a lot of people agree with that. And I understand you're coming up with this proposal, Stanford is coming up with this proposal on no net new trip and asks us to believe the university will do a great job on it. However, it just doesn't quite cut it because it's just looking at the current situation, what happens if it fails? The alternative is after you guys finish building the buildings, we cannot ask you to knock it down or kick out some of the students at that point. Just putting money in there, it might work or it might not work. And what is the limit to the monies that will be put in there? One question I also observed earlier, somebody from Stanford was also asking about all these great ideas of how it can reduce trip. I think it's a great idea. Why don't we put it in place to reduce the congestion so we don't have to suffer like this already? So let's see how well does it work right now to reduce the traffic issue. The other thing, as Mr. Bob Moss or Ms. Priya Grave also mentioned, the TDM really needs to be measured 24/7. We cannot just measure 1 day or 2 days in a year on a very selective period of time. A lot of these can be gained very easily or driving around a certain corridor. So we really need to look at the totality, the whole area as a whole to really study a good TDM program to really result in some way to measure the right pattern of traffic. And now, I have a question for Supervisor Simitian. You mentioned earlier that you are just one of the 4 supervisors will be voting on this. You're the closest to us, which Palo Alto has the most impact. How are we going to influence the other 4 supervisors to make sure that our concern will be met?
I'm sure they will be happy to know that I'm going to encourage you to be in touch with them directly to share your concerns. Just be clear, this phenomenon affects us all. I vote routinely on matters that are unfolding in the Gilroy or Morgan Hill area in unincorporated San Martin. I do not represent that part of the county. It is not within my district. But I'm expected when I show up to cast an informed vote, just as all 5 members of the board are. This instance is a little bit different because Stanford is a unique case in our county in terms of the unincorporated county. Most of the development in our county goes into the 15 incorporated cities, whether it's Palo Alto, San Jose, and that has been a policy of the county now for decades, that urban growth goes into urban population centers, meaning incorporated cities. Stanford, of course, is in some respects an entity unto itself, and notwithstanding that, the half of the campus, the roughly 4,000 acres out of the 8,000 acres that are in unincorporated Santa Clara County, are governed by the Board of Supervisors, which, as I said, has 1 district supervisor that represents this area, but 4 others who do not. And again, this is the norm on all of our land use issues in Santa Clara County. So please be in touch with them. Please use this EIR process to communicate. And at some point, there will be an opportunity to communicate at the Planning Commission, the County Planning Commission, where there are 7 appointed members, and you will be able to communicate directly to them at the Planning Commission meeting or meetings. And you will also be able to communicate directly to the 5 members of the Board of Supervisors at the meeting or meetings where this issue is taken up as the process unfolds. And I should just highlight, and because I was particularly pleased about this, Mr. Gerard mentioned that there will in fact be a meeting of the Planning Commission here in Palo Alto in November, and I believe it's to take comments on the draft EIR at that time as well. So if you were thinking to yourselves, how do I talk to somebody in addition to Joe Simitian, that particular meeting with the Planning Commission presents an opportunity next month, and it is, thank you, Mr. Gerard, it is November 30th, which is a Thursday, from 7 to 9 p.m. at the Palo Alto Arts Center Auditorium. That's the old City Hall, which probably doesn't tell most of you much. It's next to what is now the Rinconada Library, or the building formerly known as the Main Library, just to follow the Bouncewell history. So corner of Embarcadero and Newell is the easiest way to say it, November 30th, and the draft EIR comment period will include that meeting, which involves our County Planning Commission as well. But you really do need to engage at some point in the process with all 5 members of the Board of Supervisors, because nothing gets decided at the Board of Supervisors by 1 vote. Okay? Thank you. And that was Mr. Ang, yes? And then Gabby, you've been very patient. And it's Ms. Badika, yes? How am I doing on the pronunciation, by the way?
Excellent. I'm a language teacher at Stanford, you get an A+.
Thank you.
So I'm actually a PhD student, like I said, at Stanford. I live in grad housing in Escondido Village. I'm from Vancouver, a very posh city with its own very big housing crisis. I think the average rent for a student in Vancouver is about $1,700 US right now. And very much the university tries to cope as much as it can, but the waiting list is humongous, many times what is at Stanford, and the answer is basically, we've done all we can, you're on your own. So I would really like to commend Stanford as a grad student for helping us in the situation and for making it as much as easy as possible to pull us out of off-campus. We all know about the new graduate housing project that's being developed for the university with our approximately 2,000 spaces. They've been very good at working with the students. What we want to avoid as soon as we can, it's already bad that it's happening, but is the situation that was cited earlier about the graduate student living in a van. That's what we want to avoid. And that's why I think it's important to plan all the spaces ahead. And I know that it looks like a lot of growth, but I agree with the increase that they need. And I think that I also agree with, like somebody said earlier, the slight increase in undergraduate students. I teach undergraduate students languages, mostly Spanish. These are amazing students. They're a pleasure to teach. The time I spend with them in the classroom is by far my favorite part of the day. They're from all walks of life, from all over the country, some international students as well. Right now, so many of them want to get in, and Stanford being the smallest percentage of admitted students, like the smallest rate, it's the school that all the kids want to come to, and they're so good when they come here that I think that the small increase, the project supports will be good. And for graduate students, like I am one myself, I just wanted to say that we very much want to be active members of the community. We don't want to harm the community or do things to not make the life of the residents better. We're very appreciative of being given this tremendous chance to go to Stanford. It's a life-changing opportunity. I'm not from the area, I'm not from the country, but I'm so grateful for the time I have here to study and live, and we don't really want to be isolated. We want to teach and mentor the kids in the Bay. So many of us do that now. There's everything from science programs to language teaching programs. We want to be engaged with your kids, and we want to work together to find the best way that we can all grow together. And we don't want to be an imposition. We just want to do the best we can. So I hope that everybody can work together to figure out the best solutions.
Thank you very much for your comments. Dan Sakaguchi, and then the last two speakers will be Edie Keating and Francisco Preciado, if you are all still here. Welcome, Mr. Sakaguchi.
All right. Good evening, Supervisor Simitian. I just want to echo thoughts of others and thank you for choosing a time and location that makes it convenient for students like myself to attend this event. So my name is Dan Sakaguchi. I am a graduate student like others here, and I am here speaking tonight on behalf of the Stanford Coalition for Planning an Equitable 2035, also known as SCOPE 2035. We are a coalition of graduate and undergraduate students at Stanford University, working with Stanford's union, SEIU Local 2007, who care deeply about the future of our community. We are here tonight as students because we are concerned about the environmental review does not accurately assess the true burdens of Stanford's development on its neighbors. We remain concerned about Stanford's projected impacts on housing, transportation, and sustainability. We will be submitting a complete list of our concerns about the analysis contained in the EIR in writing to the county. Tonight, though, we would like to bring up three preliminary issues. First, we are concerned that the EIR deems population and housing impacts as less than significant. The EIR estimates that Stanford's projected population will contribute to 3.5% of East Palo Alto's future household growth and up to 10% in some cities, I believe. However, the study does not consider the effects of housing demand at different income levels, as you mentioned earlier. Considering that these off-site households will include the lowest wage workers at Stanford, graduate students, postdoc students, staff, and other workers, we are concerned that this population increase could place significant housing pressure and displacement effects, specifically on low-income households in East Palo Alto and other low-income jurisdictions. As one piece of our critique, we believe that the analysis should be revised to include a breakdown of population growth by income demographic as a standard in the state's housing needs assessment methodology. Second, we are concerned that no alternatives focus on the management of Stanford's traffic during off-peak hours, as others have already mentioned as well. We believe that it is important to include in a project alternative in which Stanford expands its TDM programs to benefit workers and staff who commute during off-peak hours. We ask that this analysis be added to the final EIR. Third, we are concerned about the finding that climate change impacts of Stanford expansion are also deemed less than significant. California has codified its climate goals through AB 32 and SB 32 to reduce emissions by 80% from 1990 levels by 2050, following the global realization that decarbonization is essential for avoiding the irreversible impacts of a changing climate. Stanford is directly contradicting this trend, however, by not fully mitigating the carbon emissions of its expansion and not releasing a plan for a carbon-neutral future. Universities of a similar magnitude, such as the University of California system, have set carbon-neutral goals for the upcoming decades, demonstrating that it is a feasible alternative. Again, we will publish a full set of our comments to the county in the coming weeks. We look forward to a continued conversation about how the final EIR can fully document the project's proposed impacts on housing, transportation, sustainability, and more. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your comments. Edie Keating to be followed by Francisco Preciado, and I believe that's the last pair of cards we've got. So if there's one lurking out there, please bring it up right away so we can include you. Ms. Keating, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So, like many others, I'm just skimming so far, but I'm on the transportation section. Part of TDM says direct incentives to commuters who choose alternative modes. So perhaps it's there and I haven't found it, but I would love to see a list of those incentives and what they are. And I would also like to see how compliance is monitored and enforced. This may not be shocking, but I've met one person who accepted one of those incentives and didn't really comply with what they were saying they would do. So I'm just curious about the enforcement and monitoring. I would also like to know how no net new trips looks like without the credits. And I wonder if it's easy to get data. I wonder how many Uber trips onto campus are taking place. Then on another topic, I'm curious about the process for a smaller alternative. And in particular, I think a smaller alternative that did not have any, that was even on the housing units additionally provided and the jobs that were being created would be one that would address the huge upswell of community interest in having this not make our community, sorry, but worse. So I don't know how you, move forward a smaller alternative, and I would be curious to hear more about that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And that brings us to our final speaker, I believe, Francisco Preciado. Mr. Preciado, thank you for your patience. By virtue of the Simitian shuffle, you ended up being last in the list, so I have to own that. Welcome.
Perfect. Thank you. So good evening, Supervisor Simitian. Thank you for putting this community input meeting together and for listening how the community feels. I'm here on behalf of SEIU Local 2007, which represents over 1,200 service and technical workers on the campus at Stanford. And we'd like to echo some of Scope 2035's comments and some of the community members regarding affordable housing. We're here to ask specifically that the university show that they care about workers and the surrounding community by creating affordable housing for the service workers on campus. This would address both the housing shortage and mitigate the traffic impacts because, of course, less workers would have to commute. We have workers coming from Tracy, Santa Cruz, and among other cities, which takes several hours. Some members say it takes 4 to 6 hours to commute to and from work. That's not working, that's just the commute. If Stanford really values its workers and the surrounding community, it would build more affordable housing for workers and provide more transportation options like a bus from East Palo Alto to campus and allow Slack workers, which they currently do not have access to, Stanford's transportation programs. I believe we can be creative in developing solutions to the various issues that were raised. What about using the Stanford Affordable Housing Fund that's given to the county to build affordable housing for the lowest income service workers on campus? Lastly, I believe Stanford doesn't plan to change its community plan, but maybe through a community benefits agreement that addresses many of the needs outlined and mentioned today. Stanford can also commit to taking a neutral position when workers want to collectively organize and become a part of a union. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Now, before everyone bolts for the door, let me ask, are there any other cards from folks who wish to be heard this evening? All right, if not, then let me say thank you again for coming. Let me again remind everyone that the next currently scheduled public meeting to receive comments on the draft EIR is at the Palo Alto Arts Center on November 30th from 7 to 9 p.m., and that is hosted by the County Planning Commission. The draft EIR public comment period extends through 5 p.m. on December the 4th, so if comments are going to be made after folks have had a little more time to take a look, that's the deadline date. As was mentioned earlier, you can find the documents that have been referenced either at the Planning Department's webpage or on my own, supervisorsimidian.org, and if you click on the Stanford Draft EIR button on my page, you'll get right there. There are hard copies at the planning counter here at City Hall, if I understand correctly, and at Green Library at Stanford, and at the Rinconada Library, and I think at the Mitchell Park Library. Let me look to staff. But we heard the shout out about College Terrace, and I'll put the staff on the spot by saying we're going to manage that in the next week.
Yes, we are.
Thank you. And I think we've had a similar request, by the way, from the folks in Menlo Park. Again, a reminder, we can't take your comments into consideration if the comments are not made, and there are 5 members of the Board of Supervisors. And with those last 2 reminders, let me just say again how much I appreciate your willingness as a community to come out and give the better part of your evening to this process. Thanks as well to the folks from Stanford who were present, county planning staff who already had a long day before they arrived, the consulting team, and the 2 members of my office staff who pulled all this together for all of us. And of course, last but not least, thank you to the City of Palo Alto for hosting us. Without objection, our meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.